Paul had never been the model of a perfect man. Mary sometimes punished herself harshly for succumbing to her hormones and falling in love with him at first sight. At first, her husband literally waited on Mary hand and foot, spending large sums of money on her whims and agreed with everything she said. But over time, the woman discovered that Paul had no opinion of his own. The man had been used to obeying his mother since childhood, and when she died, he was desperate to find a woman who would order his life. Paul did everything he was asked to do, but he couldn't think about what needed to be done. Mary was getting annoyed by this. She was exhausted, holding many things in her mind. The woman decided to take full control of the finances. She caused a scandal, took her husband's bank card, and demanded the passwords to the internet banking. That is when she found out the reason for the lavish gifts. Her husband didn't know how to manage money as well as he didn't know how to live alone. There was a debt on the credit account and large sums on the statement. Mary knew where the money was spent: a trip to the Maldives, a new fur coat, a professional food processor. She was so happy when she received these gifts, and now what to do with the enormous debt, she didn't know. The thought of divorce flashed through her mind, but it was uneasy. All her friends had long since been married. Mary had caught enough wry glances before. She didn't want to be like everyone else again. A few months after the wedding, a terrible thing happened. At work, Paul had fallen from a height onto an iron beam with his back and had been taken to the intensive care unit. Mary was on her way to the hospital with mixed feelings. She didn't know what was better, for her husband to survive or for him to leave her a widow. The latter option would automatically relieve her of a number of problems, including her loan obligations, which she was slowly paying off with her husband's salary. At the hospital, the head of the department told Mary that Paul's spine had been damaged and he would be permanently bedridden. The doctor said that the chance of getting her husband back on his feet was slim and that regular exercise was needed. Mary left the office deep in thought, and in the evening she pounded her pillow with her fists, swallowing angry tears. "Why aren't you dead?" she asked the emptiness. "All you know how to do is cause trouble for others." A week later, Paul was brought home. The man looked exhausted, but genuinely happy to be within his own walls. The medical staff left, and Mary realized with horror that she was alone with her husband. On the first day, it became clear that she herself couldn't cope with a bedridden man. She was unable to feed Paul, to help him to the toilet, to bathe him. She was disgusted, physically struggling, and wanted to run away somewhere far away. Paul also wanted attention. He needed someone sitting next to him and talking to him. But Mary had to go to work. She turned on the television for her husband and left for the day. When she returned, Paul was spinning his eyes widely. His mouth was so dry he couldn't speak because she hadn't thought to leave water. The sheets and mattresses were hopelessly soiled, and the man couldn't take more than 8 hours of waiting. This made Mary terribly angry. She knew that it wasn't Paul's fault, but her emotions overwhelmed her. She slammed the door, leaving her husband to suffer further. To calm down, she called her friends. One of them suggested hiring a carer. Another gave the contact details of a pleasant pensioner who looked after the disabled for a modest fee. Mary immediately rang the number and made an appointment. In the morning, a nice old lady appeared on the doorstep. Mary doubted her abilities, but Mrs. White turned out to be a former nurse with a wealth of experience. She handled Paul's morning toilet with ease and then fed him just as easily. Mary was pleased. She ran off happily to work, and when she returned, she found the idle, fed husband lying on fresh sheets, listening intently to the nurse. Mrs. White was reading a book aloud. Mary's mind had been far from home lately. Their firm cooperated with foreign colleagues, so every few months, a specialist came in from abroad to exchange experiences. This week, Edward came into the office. The entire female half of the staff immediately let out a rapturous sigh and could think of nothing else until the end of the working day. The man turned out to be handsome, intelligent, and courteous, and even knew a little bit of the language. It was enough to finally enchant Mary. Edward separated her from the others, and after a few days, he asked her to lunch with him. The impetuous affair had so turned her head that Mary had forgotten about her bedridden husband and all her problems. She was once again blown off dust particles, loved, cherished, and catered to her every whim. She began to sleep at home less and less often. earning reproachful looks from her nurse. But, like all business trips, Edward's trip was coming to an end. He invited Mary to a fancy restaurant, gave her a huge bouquet of roses, ordered live music, told her about his imminent departure, and asked her to keep him company. Then Edward got down on one knee and held out his ring. Mary was taken aback. This was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. She couldn't refuse it under any circumstances. But at home, like an anchor, she was held by Paul. The woman promised Edward that she would think about it, and she wandered slowly back to her flat, clutching the expensive ring in her hands. At home, the unpleasant smell of a bed-bound person lingered. Paul was snoozing peacefully on the bed, water was on the table nearby, and books were lying around. Mary walked over to the large mirror, scrutinizing her reflection. Beautiful, still young, the whole look screams of a desire to live. Why limit yourself and ruin your whole life? Edward is a chance to make all my dreams to come true, and Paul is a load pulling me down, she thought. Mary had barely slept that night, thinking of her next steps, and in the morning, even before the carer arrived, she'd run out of the house on business. It took a long time to persuade certain people and a lot of money in bribes, but by the evening, Mary had the divorce papers. Edward got the consent and immediately went to book an extra plane ticket, while Mary quietly packed her suitcase. She decided not to go into Paul's room, and she was afraid to warn Mrs. White either. Mary thought the compassionate pensioner wouldn't leave Paul alone, and she wasn't mistaken. The next morning, Mary left the flat at dawn, picking up her 2 suitcases and set off for her new life, throwing off the shackles of the old one. A few hours later, the couple were on board the plane. Mrs. White bought some large ripe apples on the way and grabbed a jar of honey from home to surprise Paul. The man had once confided that he liked baked apples. The pensioner was already anticipating how his eyes would widen with surprise when she brought the treat into the room. Besides, she couldn't wait to see if Paul had bragged about his achievements. Mary had been saying lately that she had a lot of work to do, came home late, and rarely spoke to her husband. Mrs. White and Paul, meanwhile, were actively engaged in strengthening exercises. There was a surprise waiting for Mrs. White in the kitchen. On the table were the divorce papers, the keys, and a note. The woman ran her eyes over the lines and angrily threw the paper into the rubbish bin. For the first 3 years, Mary had lived well. Her new husband's good job allowed her not to work and to spend all of her time on herself. Then the recession hit, Edward was laid off, and the family was in trouble. Her husband insisted that Mary look for work, but she had never learned an unfamiliar language, so she couldn't apply for a good position. Mary didn't have to endure Edward's nagging for long, so she grabbed her things and headed back to the old house. Mary thought that Paul, if he was still alive, would be sure to take her back. He was such a jerk, he wouldn't even think of crossing her. However, the familiar door to the flat was opened by a young woman with a small child in her arms. "Excuse me, Paul used to live here," Mary was taken aback. "Paul is helping Grandma," she smiled. "They'll be home soon." "Oh, here they are." Mary looked around and began gasping in fear. Paul was walking up the stairs, alive and well, walking on his own feet, carrying a bag of groceries. Next to him, leaning on his arm, was Mrs. White. "Mary," the ex-husband wondered, "why are you here?" "May we speak in private?" The woman frowned. "I have no time for that," Paul replied with a smile. "I promised to take her for a walk outside." Mary watched in a daze as her ex-husband carried the bag into the flat. The woman kissed him on the cheek. He picked up the child and walked away. "We've been putting Paul back on his feet for over 3 years," Mrs. White said suddenly. "Whatever you came here for, go away. You don't belong here." This happens in life. Chasing riches can make it easy to end up with nothing, as it did for Mary. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon to stay in contact. Feel free to stick around and watch our other videos. And with that, we'll see you next time.